Please take a seat so we can move on. Thank you very much. We are very happy to welcome now the scientific attaché at the CNRS Historical Committee. He will tell us more about someone who is a female symbol of scientific mobility at a time when it was not so common to travel this much, and someone who also is the reason why we are here today. I'm talking, of course, about Marie Sklodowska Curie and Denis Guthleben.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to confess that it is an honor, but also a real and great challenge to say a few words about Marie Sklodowska Curie in these places around where she lived, where she worked, where she struggled with her experiments, where she confronted the prejudices of her time, which are sometimes still those of her time, even where she loved and where she achieved the universal fame we all know. Today, Université PSL is one of the major depositories of her legacy, especially through two of its components, the Higher School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry of the city of Paris, founded in 1882, and which was still called at the time of Marie and Pierre Curie the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry, and the Curie Institute, previously called the Radium Institute, created by Marie Curie herself after years of hard work. So many thanks to Alain Fuchs and his efficient team, Evan Aidou, Camille Roger, Nelly Manoukian for their invitation and for hosting this great event. And now let's get down to business. As announced, a short biography of Marie Sklodowska Curie. That's really an easy exercise. Born in Warsaw in 1867, Maria Sklodowska went in 1891 to Paris, where she adapted her name to the more French-sounding Marie, quickly improved her knowledge of the French language, and obtained, among the very first places, her master's degrees in physics in 1893 and mathematics in 1894, the year she met Pierre Curie. She decided at the end of 1897 to undertake a doctorate in physics on the invisible rays emitted by uranium discovered by Henri Becquerel. She published her first scientific paper in 1898, for which she was awarded a prize from the Academy of Sciences, announced the same year the discovery of polonium and shortly after of radium, obtained two other prizes of the Academy of Sciences. In June 1903, she defended the doctoral thesis entitled Research on Radioactive Substances and was awarded with Pierre Curie the Davy Medal of the Royal Society of London in October, and with Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel the Nobel Prize for Physics in December. So the PhD and the Nobel Prize the same year. Should I continue? I certainly could, for the rest of my speech, even for the rest of the day, following the example of the many biographies and mentioning, among a lot of other facts, a second Nobel Prize in chemistry. So Marie Curie was not only the first woman to win a Nobel, but also to this day the only scientist with two Nobel Prizes. With two Nobel Prizes in two different sciences, and we could go on this way even after her death in 1934, because she became the first woman to enter the Panthéon in Paris, the sacred temple of our republic, and she entered it, as President François Mitterrand explained at that time, I quote, for her own merits. Because Sophie Berthelot, the only woman buried in the Panthéon before Marie Curie, it was in 1907, was buried with her husband, Marcelin Berthelot, only since he had asked to remain beside his wife, even in death. spent eternity alongside Marcelin Berthelot, blessing or punishment. This will be the title of a future meeting. Just like the Panthéon itself where she rests, Marie Curie finally acquired the status of a monument, a genius among scientists, an ideal among men, a saint among women, and countless events, operations, places, actions have been named in her memory, of course, especially in the scientific field, like the MSCA, but not only. And as a confidence, my colleagues and I have often explained to young girls hesitating to embark on a scientific career that they can do it. Look at Marie Curie. But we did this without always realizing the paralyzing effect such announcement could have on young apprentice students, scientists. I don't know if I would have gotten far in my own career if someone had told me, look at Fernand Braudel. He did it. Precisely, Marie Curie was not a monument, and not just a singular, exceptional scientist, a singular, exceptional woman. From a certain point of view, she was indeed that, but she was also a scientist and a woman who experienced the same wishes, the same satisfactions, the same difficulties as other scientists and other women with strong abilities, opinions, and ambitions in her days and in other times. That's the reason she keeps talking to us in the field of scientific research and far beyond it. To be honest, when I started to think about this speech a few months ago, I had no idea that the international situation was going to make her life even more relevant than it already was. In 1867, in Warsaw, Marie Sklodowska entered a world in which almost every act bore some relation to the Poles' struggle to survive to systematic and brutal suppression of their nation. 3 years before, after the devastating defeat of the January uprising, a Polish rebellion against Russian rule, tens of thousands of Poles, among them many of most talented, were driven by the Tsar's armies in chain gangs to Siberia, most never to return. It's a painting of Alexander Chokaczewski, which depicts the stop of the exiled convoy by the obelisk that marks the end of Europe and the beginning of Asia. And for the next 50 years, the Tsar's agents will preside over a Russification that was designed to weed out every trace of Polish consciousness in education, in government, in intellectual life. Allow me to quote Marie Curie herself in her autobiographical notes. Warsaw was then under Russian domination, and one of the worst aspects of this control was the oppression exerted on the school and the child. The private schools, directed by Poles, were closely watched by the police and overburdened with the necessity of teaching the Russian language even to children so young that they could scarcely speak their native Polish. All instruction was given in Russian by Russian professors who treated their pupils as enemies. Amid these hostilities, they lost all the joy of life. On the other side, this abnormal situation resulted in exciting the patriotic feeling of Polish youth to the highest degree. Of course, I am not going to tell the whole story of the youth of Marie Sklodowska, her graduation from gymnasium, where, as she noted, she learned easily mathematics and physics as far as these sciences were taken in consideration. Her efforts at self-education, nevertheless, in a relatively healthy family environment, far from the poverty that has regularly been described. Her participation to the so-called Flying University, a secret organization aimed at providing education outside of Russian control, and so flying in secret between different locations, and the pact of mutual aid with her sister Bronia, which led her to remain governess in Poland until 1891. From the her earliest years, if we can say that she lived through misery, she experienced the tragedies of her time, tragedies we sincerely thought we will never see again. And she really put her life, or at least her freedom, in danger, teaching her pupils and children in small classes. She organized how to read and write with Polish book an initiative of this kind could lead to Siberia even for a young woman of 20. So before discovering the value of science, Maria Sklodowska learned in her flesh, learned in her soul, an even greater value, freedom, without which science isn't much. There is no possible science where thought is not free, as a future colleague and friend of Marie Curie, the physicist Jean Perrin, will declare in a different context in the 1930s. And finally, in 1891 came Paris. Paris, the city of light, the city of science and progress, where the Eiffel Tower was inaugurated 2 years before for the International Exhibition of 1889. But curiously, Maria Sklodowska didn't write a word about that wonderful building. The city of open mind, where, to take only one example, the young student of the Faculty of Law, Jeanne Chauvin. Jeanne Chauvin was about to defend her dissertation and about to be so harassed by male spectators that she had to finish up her examination in private. But Marie Sklodowska didn't pay attention to that particular event. After being affectionately welcomed by her sister and brother-in-law, she was, as she noted, entirely absorbed in the joy of learning. As she wrote to a friend in Poland, work gives life the sweet taste of happiness. I did say that Marie Curie always talks to us, but I did not say that we must always agree with her. What Marie Sklodowska first discovered in Paris was freedom. Not a freedom to fight for, but a freedom established and recognized, especially for the students who attended classes between the old buildings and the Nouvelle Sorbonne that the architect Henri-Paul Nénaud was struggling to build at that time, and they were free to attend classes as frequently as they wanted, to choose when to take the exams, or not to take the exams at all. Reflecting many years later on this education, she described feeling a bit disoriented at first, but she quickly picked up its spirit and came to feel that it would be difficult to return to a system in which, as she wrote, personality would be allowed less free expression. What she also discovered in Paris were the marvelous and eternal joys of the city. In 1891, Paris had to deal with a major transport strike, which probably counted in her decision to leave the 19th district where her sister lived in a comfortable apartment and move to a room in the Quartier Latin. She wrote to her brother Joseph, "I decided to live nearer to the schools as it has become necessary for several reasons. I am writing to you, in fact, from my new lodging. It is a little room, very suitable and nevertheless very cheap. In a quarter of an hour, I can be in the chemistry laboratory in 20 minutes at the Sorbonne." And what Marie Sklodowska discovered too was the price of choosing freedom. In fact, her room wasn't suitable at all, but as she wrote afterwards in her a bit dramatic style, a garret, very cold in winter, and it was not unusual for the water to freeze in the night. But as she wrote too in her notes, this life had a real charm. It gave me a precious sense of freedom, always freedom, a key word throughout her life. All my mind was centered on my studies, which, especially at the beginning, were difficult. I was insufficiently prepared to follow the physical course at the Sorbonne, for despite all my efforts, I had not succeeded in acquiring in Poland a preparation as complete as that of the French students. So I divided my time between courses, experimental work, and study in the library. In the evening, I worked in my room, sometimes very late into the night. So while the precariousness of students remained a big concern today, and one of the main causes of dropping out of studies, fortunately, the painful living and working conditions that Marie Sklodowska chose and endured did not prevent her from achieving her first academic successes. She ranked first among those taking the licence et sciences, the master's degree exam in 1893, and immediately started to study mathematics unceasingly, as she wrote to her brother Joseph in September, so as to be up to date when courses begin. In 1894, the young woman, who, according to her own testimony, was poorly prepared at Warsaw, ranked second in the licence S Mathématiques, a master's degree. For myself, as she wrote in her autobiographical notes, I shall always consider one of the best memories of my life that period of solitary years exclusively devoted to studies. Perhaps this is the second key word to remember, not misery, not exhausting work, even if it was, but its counterpart, a burning desire to learn, which is the spur of a scientific career and which would stimulate her throughout her life too. And while reading her notes, we can observe that what Marie Sklodowska went through during her first years in Paris as a student continued, at least in her professional life, after meeting Pierre Curie. Yes. And their wedding in 1896. At that time, Pierre Curie was studying crystals, and Marie Curie looking for a subject for her thesis. Let's listen to her again. Our attention was caught by a curious phenomenon discovered in 1896 by Henri Becquerel. The discovery of the X-ray by Röntgen had excited the imagination, and many physicists were trying to discover if similar rays were not emitted by fluorescent bodies under the action of light. With this question in mind, Henri Becquerel was studying uranium salts, and as sometimes occurs, I really like this sentence, as sometimes occurs, so Henri Becquerel came upon a phenomenon different from that he was looking for, the spontaneous emission by uranium salts of rays of a peculiar character. And she continued, my husband obtained from the director of the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry the authorization to use a glass-tin study on the ground floor, which was then being used as a storeroom. The description she made of this place is well known. A wooden shed with a bituminous floor and a glass roof which did not keep the rain out, and without any interior arrangements. The only objects it contained were some worn pine tables, a cast iron stove, which worked badly, and the blackboard which Pierre Curie loved to use. There were no hoods to carry away the poisonous gases thrown off in our chemical treatments, so that it was necessary to carry them on outside in the cart. But when the weather was unfavorable, we went on with them inside, leaving the windows open. So did Marie Curie darken the picture? It will not be the first time, and certainly not the last, that scientists complained about their working conditions. This habit is almost as old as science itself. Nevertheless, we have not only photographic evidences, but also testimonies. My favorite is the one written by Wilhelm Ostwald, the German chemist who was one of the first to realize the importance of the work conducted by Marie and Pierre Curie, and asked to see their laboratory during a stay in Paris in 1899. He wrote afterwards, "It was a cross between a stable and a potato shed. And if I had not seen the work table and items of chemical apparatus, I would have thought that I was being played a practical joke." Nevertheless, the work began, and as Marie Curie noted, in order to go beyond result reached by Becquerel, it was necessary to employ a precise quantitative method. The phenomenon that best lent itself to measurement was the conductibility produced in the air by the uranium rays. This phenomenon, called ionization, is produced also by X-rays for measuring the very feeble currents that one can make pass through air ionized by uranium rays. I had at my disposition an excellent method developed by Pierre and Jacques Curie. It consists in counterbalancing on a sensitive electrometer the quantity of electricity carried by the current with that which a piezoelectric quartz can furnish. My experiments prove that the radiation of uranium compounds can be measured with precision under determined conditions, and that this radiation is an atomic property of the element of radium. And she continued continue. Its intensity is proportionally to the quantity of uranium contained in the compound and depends neither on the conditions of chemical combinations nor on external circumstances. I undertook next to discover if there were other elements possessing the same property, and with this aim, I examined all the elements then known. I found that among these bodies, thorium compounds are the only ones which emit rays similar to those of uranium. Its radiation has an intensity of the same order as that of uranium and is, as in the case of uranium, an atomic property of the element. I continue just for a moment. It was necessary at this point to find a new term to define this new property of matter, and Marie Curie wrote, I proposed the word radioactivity, which has since become generally adopted. During the course of my research, I had occasion to examine not only simple compounds, but also a great number of minerals. Certain ones proved radioactive. These were those containing uranium and thorium, but their radioactivity seemed abnormal, for it was much greater than the amount I had found in uranium and thorium had led me to expect. This abnormality greatly surprised us. I made the hypothesis that the ores, uranium, and thorium contain in small quantity a substance much more strongly radioactive than either uranium or thorium. This substance could not be one of the known elements because these had already been examined. It must therefore be a new chemical element. Stop the quoting. Alors Pierre Curie, keenly interested in the question, abandoned his work on crystals to join Marie Curie in the search for this unknown substance. Finally, they soon recognized that the radioactivity was concentrated principally in two different chemical fractions and became able to recognize in a pitch blende, uranium ore, the presence of at least two new radioactive elements, polonium and radium. Nevertheless, the work was far from finished. In their opinion, there could be no doubt of the existence of these new elements. But to make chemists admit their existence, and chemists were and are particularly hard people to convince, it was necessary to isolate them. I mean, isolate the new elements and not the chemists. I won't detail the efforts made to these achievements, recalling only that it took 2 years of exhausting work. Some have called these years the heroic epoch in their life. In fact, it was a grueling epoch, especially for Marie Curie, who carried out the chemical separations, and sometimes she remembered afterwards, I had to spend a whole day stirring a boiling mass with a heavy iron rod nearly as big as myself. I would be broken with fatigue at day's end. And at day's end, we could imagine that Marie and Pierre Curie returned home with the satisfaction of a job well done. But as she wrote, sometimes we returned in the evening after dinner. Our precious products were arranged on tables and boards. From all sides, we could see their slightly luminous silhouette, and this gleaming suspended in the darkness stirred us with ever new emotion and enchantment. Emotion, enchantment, we can keep these two more keywords in mind, and they characterize the work and the state of mind of Marie Curie, and following her example on many other, they characterized and must foremost characterized, continue to characterize scientific research. Then finally, in July 1902, Marie Curie announced that she had successfully isolated 1 decigram of radium. 22 years later, physicist Jean Perrin noted that it is not an exaggeration to say that it is the cornerstone on which the entire edifice of radioactivity rests. Of course, with the major discovery theorized by Marie Curie as early as 1898, that radioactivity is an intrinsic property of the atom. In 1903, Marie and Pierre Curie were awarded half the Nobel Prize in physics and Becquerel the other half. The citation was in recognition of the extraordinary services they have rendered by the joint researchers on the radiation phenomena discovered by Professor Becquerel. However, neither Marie nor Pierre Curie was able to come to Stockholm to receive the prize. And Pierre Curie explained in a letter to the Swedish Academy of Sciences that they could not get away because of their teaching obligations. It may seem surprising today, but receiving the Nobel Prize in Science was not quite as momentous in 1903 as it has since become. And ironically, few scientists are more responsible for increased public awareness than Marie and Pierre Curie. This effect was not immediate, especially paradoxically in France in December of 1903, when the news broke, journalists and the public were entirely preoccupied by another affair that lasted for more than 5 years and would continue for a long time, as wrote an editor of the magazine La Vie Parisienne. This tale of the Curie couple, one barely knows in France, but we have an excuse. They have reopened the Dreyfus affair. But at last, when the press did turn its cases on the Curie couple, as it is said, it used the same hyperbole that had characterized its coverage of the Dreyfus affair. And if the story lacked the conflict and the drama of the affair, journalists found a way to introduce it. Let's take a short look at the press. The press. Because long before the invention of Twitter, of the internet, even of the television, and when the radio was still in its infancy, Marie Curie had to deal with a topic that again is still relevant. Scientists in the public sphere are all dealing with the media when an event put you on the front pages. It was a hard test for both of Marie and Pierre Curie, but for journalists too. Some who came to them expecting a warm reception grew testy when they didn't receive it. I had to ring the bell 3 times, wrote the famous Gaston Rouvier of Le Temps, and after that I had to wait in a sort of parlor in which the principal ornament was a lamp on the fireplace. And things went bad to worse for him when Pierre Curie arrived. Monsieur Curie does not have experience with interviews. He answers only the questions one asks, and in 2 words. I know people who have not invented radium and who know better the art of talking about themselves. Nevertheless, at the center of the so-called tale was not Pierre, but Marie Curie, a frail woman who had ground down tons of pitchblende in order to extract a tiny amount of a magical element. But as worried a writer of the magazine Paris Sport, among many others, this fairy tale could turn into a nightmare for the whole society. Was the woman to abandon her traditional household occupations from now on to give herself over to the concrete or abstract studies which, until now, have been the privilege of the man? The woman who works is usually obliged to neglect her household, and women, in their ardent desire to liberate themselves through work and to take the place of men, will cause a considerable lowering of salaries. Oh my God. Confronted to journalists from the whole world, fortunately not all in this state of mind, Marie Curie wrote to her brother that she would like to dig into the ground. We have been pursued by journalists from all the countries. They have been so far as to reproduce the conversation of my daughter with her maid and to describe the black and white cat who lives with us. They ask us for articles, and after a few years, the very people who make these demands will be astonished to see that we have not accomplished any work. And even in the French, if the French Chamber of Deputies created a chair in physics at the Sorbonne for Pierre Curie and voted a fund to offer the job of laboratory chief to Marie Curie, chef de travaux, with the promise of building a laboratory, sooner or later, this situation did not improve until the end of 1905. In the previous summer, soon after returning from Sweden, where they finally went to receive their Nobel Prize, and where Pierre Curie gave a brief, modest, and famous lecture, humanity will derive more good than bad from new discoveries, Pierre Curie wrote that from that moment, going back to work is a question of life or death from the intellectual point of view. Hopefully, Marie Curie had to continue to face that situation alone after the dreadful accident that happened in the spring of 1906. As you probably know, Pierre Curie was run over by a horse-drawn wagon near the Pont Neuf and killed. After this terrible event, Marie Curie started to write a diary she kept for a year after the fateful day, a morning journal made available to researchers only in the 1990s, and which allows us to know her far behind the front of the monument, the genius, the ideal, the saint. Dear Pierre, she started, who I will never more see here, I want to speak to you in the silence of this laboratory where I never thought I would have to live without you. This so-called laboratory was the room at Rue Cuvier, that Marie Curie was going to furnish to set up the laboratory Pierre Curie hadn't had the time to obtain. This diary is all the more affecting that Pierre and Marie Curie had lived and had worked together for 10 years, and therefore, with few exceptions, never had written each other. Beyond death, this was their first regular correspondence. A moving example is the words she wrote on November 1906, the day after she gave her first lecture at the Sorbonne, replacing Pierre Curie. These inner words are far from the description made by the participants. What grief and what despair, wrote Marie Curie, you would have been happy to see me as a professor at the Sorbonne, and I myself would have so willingly done it for you, but to do it in your place, my Pierre, could one dream of a thing more cruel? I have nothing left but the duty to raise our children and the will to continue the work. And the work indeed continued in the laboratory at the Rue Cuvier, but also with a new project. In 1909, the Pasteur Institute and the University of Paris signed a partnership for the building of a modern research laboratory for Marie Curie, completed in 1914, a third laboratory, but in fact a first real laboratory, which was to become the Radium Institute and then the Curie Institute, and its goal was to study radioactivity and its applications in physics, chemistry, biology, medicine. The setup was very original for its time, and the Radium Institute featured the Curie Laboratory, directed by Marie Curie herself, and entirely devoted to physics and chemistry research, and the Pasteur Laboratory, directed by Claudius Regaud, and devoted to studying the biological effects and medical applications of radioactivity, a research care continuum that is still the hallmark of Curie Institute today. The foundation of the Radium Institute invites to reconsider what has been generally accepted and the bad treatment they suffered from the scientific establishment. And in fact, the Academy of Sciences provided quite a bit of early financial support. Marie Curie was thrice recipient of the Prix Gegner, and in 1903, Pierre Curie won the coveted 10,000 francs Lacasse Prize. In addition, in March of 1902, the Academy made 20,000 franc credits available for their work. The problem was not, in fact, that there was no help, but that the help wasn't the kind they really needed, and rather than piecemeal grants, a well-equipped laboratory, generous salaries for themselves and for employees, and generous salaries, that's what we all dream of, long-term investment, an MSCA funding would have helped them, perhaps, and this observation will count in the mobilization and the organization of French research in the interwar period. Before we get there, a few words on two particular moments. First, the year 1911. In a political and international tense atmosphere, with a strong friction between France and Germany, which brought the two countries to the edge of war, and nationalism to a peak, Marie Curie had to face tumultuous events. Despite her second Nobel Prize and invitation to the first Solvay conference with the world's leading scientists, it's easy to find Marie Curie. Look for the only woman. She sits between Jean Perrin and Henri Poincaré. 1911 became a dark year in her life. A nomination in the Academy of Sciences was rejected. On her private life, liaison with the physicist Paul Langevin was exposed in what her friend Jean Perrin called a landslide of filth. Allow me to pass over these events, mentioning only briefly the light they shed on the functioning of scientific institutions, of medias, and of the whole society. The landslide of filth did not only refer to prejudice against women, which was at the forefront in these two cases, and would last a long time. I remember that the first woman elected to the French Academy of Sciences was Marguerite Perret, a student of Marie Curie, but it was in 1962. But also refer to xenophobia, a changing xenophobia, especially in newspaper, which sometimes described the Nobelized Marie Curie as a symbol of French science, of French spirit, and sometimes as a foreigner who was corrupting the same science and the same spirit, and even to anti-Semitism in the lasting context of the Dreyfus affair. As noted Léon Daudet, the leader of the newspaper L'Action Française, her name, Sklodowska, indicated that she might be suspected of Jewish origins. My goodness. During this period, probably more than at any other, Marie Curie became the icon that is still celebrated today, an icon of freedom, always freedom, the same keyword from the beginning, but also, in fact, in spite of herself, a feminist icon. But almost no evidence survives of her own reaction to the tumultuous events of 1911. There is a few documents in her own words about these affairs, and certainly nothing which reveals intimate thoughts and feelings. The second particular moment lasts from 1914 to 1918. During these years, humanity derived more bad than good from new discoveries. The First World War broke out when Marie Curie was in the process of beginning to lead one of the departments in the Radium Institute. In her notes, she wrote, "The dominant duty imposed on everyone at that time was to help the country in whatever way possible. No general instructions were given by the government to the members of the university." As we say in France, nothing new under the sun. Nevertheless, scientists don't like government instructions, and in the same time dislike not to have government instruction. It's not clear. It was left to each to take his own initiative and means of action. I therefore sought to discover the most efficient way to do useful work, turning my scientific knowledge to most profit. And this most efficient way remains well known and was told by Marie Curie herself in one of my favorite books, testimony books, published in 1921 and called Radiology and the War, the organization of radiologic services in which her young daughter Irene was too involved, since it had been ascertained for several years that the X-rays offered extremely useful means for the examination of the wounded, but radiologic installations existed only in a very small number of places. These pictures with Marie Curie and Irene Curie are famous as the radiologic cars Marie Curie equipped, which came to be popularly known as Petite Curie, Little Curies. But less known are her efforts to train all the operators, the technicians, the nurses, and even the surgeons throughout the war. Whatever the attacks, the persecution Marie Curie had endured the years before the war, that period was for her her a time of complete involvement for her adoptive country in gruesome conditions. I can never forget the terrible impression of all that destruction of human life and health, she wrote. To aid the very idea of war, it ought to be sufficient to see once what I have seen so many times, men and boys brought to the advanced ambulance in a mixture of mud and blood, many of them dying from their injuries. I am afraid my time is perhaps running out, and yet there is so much left to say. Let's accelerate toward the conclusion and only mention the energy she devoted until her last days to the Radium Institute, this cluster of tan brick and stone buildings where she claimed the inner courtyard by planting trees. I think this picture was taken from this courtyard. You will be able to see later next to the beautiful Curie Museum. Her visit to the United States, where one of the leading women journalists, Marie Meloni, had launched a campaign to have the women of America contribute to buy a gram of radium for her use, and her visit to the White House to receive this gift from President Harding, where she had to play a ceremonial role that she hated more and more, as she confided in a letter written in 1925. I wonder what fundamental vice there is in human organization which makes this form of agitation necessary. And what is beyond denying is the sincerity of all those who do these things and their conviction that they must do them. Her joy to seeing young scientists like Marguerite Perret, Salomon Rosenblum, and of course Irene Curie and Frédéric Joliot following in her footsteps. Marie Curie lived to see the discovery of the so-called artificial radioactivity, but not to hear that they had been awarded the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1935. Her participation to the fifth and one of the more important Solvay conference in 1927, I will not say more, except once again look for the only woman, and the role she played until her last days alongside Jean Perrin, physicist Jean Perrin, in his campaigns for government support for scientific research. Jean Perrin is next to her on this picture taken during a visit to the Radium Institute in 1928 of the President of the Republic, the famous Gaston Doumergue. Okay. He was called Gastounet by the French for his plump joviality. So, of course, joviality cannot be the final word of this too short biography of Marie Sklodowska Curie. And in fact, even if some key words, starting with that of freedom, deserve to be kept in memory, there can be no final word at all to summarize such a life, which must not be contemplated as a good behavior guide, a kind of inspiring saint's life like in the Middle Ages, but which must be studied and then which can still lead us to reflect on our own choices, on our own experiences, organizations, values, etc. Marie Sklodowska Curie did not choose to be born in an occupied country or to face one of the deadliest wars in history, but she made her choices and decisions to face this dreadful situation. Marie Sklodowska Curie was not a theorist of school education, but she experimented new teaching methods at school, at university, at home. Marie Sklodowska Curie did not seek to become a feminist icon, but she had to face prejudice and to find her own ways to deal with them. Marie Sklodowska Curie should have been a rich woman, yes, yet she took out no patent on the processes by which radium was produced. As she confided to Marie Meloni, radium was not to enrich anyone. Radium is an element. It belongs to all people. Marie Sklodowska Curie campaigned for pure and disinterested research, but she always cared about its applications. Marie Sklodowska Curie did not try to reform the whole scientific organization, but she and the people who worked with her unquestionably left their mark on it in the following decades in France and up to the present day in Europe. Perhaps a century later, life does not always give the right answers, but it often continues to pose the right questions. And I will later have the last words taken from the conclusion of the book I quote above, Radiology and the War. The repercussions of creative thinking are endless. Every civilized community has a bounded duty to look after the domain of pure science, to protect and encourage those who work in it, and provide them with all necessary support. Only then can we grow and pursue harmonious development. Thank you very much for that attention.
Thank you very much, Denis Guthleben, for this recollection of Marie Curie's life and myth. It was a time when a woman could have received 2 Nobel Prizes and not be accepted into the French Academy of Sciences. It was a... Yes, Academy of Science was a serious thing, just said Denis Guthleben. Okay, let's move on to our round table. You know that each year at the Marie Sklodowska Curie conference, we have this type of conference. We have a round table because one of the goals that we try to achieve is to provide the European Commission with quality recommendations regarding the MSCA program. We need to consider the MSCA program's future in order to best support the next generations of researchers who will benefit from it. And this is exactly what we are going to do during this roundtable, thanks to our speakers, who are Claire Morel, Graça Raposo, Karen Strobons, and Thomas Bonnard. Please come with me on stage.